In this second of this inspirational and devotional series on communion and how big is your cup, I want to just take a moment and pull one word out of the Bible and out of the Last Supper. It's a very important word. It's extremely important to the people of Israel and was very much a part of their life and their way of life and the way that they did relationship as families and relationship with God. And we find it in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 5, which is actually just before the verse, which is really the centerpiece of the Passover service as we know it. And in verse 5 it says this, "And furthermore, I've heard the groanings of the sons of Israel, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant." And it's that word, remembered. The word remember actually means to reattach ourselves. We sometimes talk of the members of a body. If we've become disconnected, then in a way we could talk about remembering, reattaching, reconnecting ourselves. And what God's saying here is not so much that he's forgotten, but he's reconnected himself to the covenant that he had made with the people of Israel. And then we see that Jesus uses the same phrase in a slightly different way, but actually at the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper or the Passover that he's sharing with his disciples, he says this. He says, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this, remember me." I just have a feeling that Jesus is lining some things up here. Now, the people of Israel were known for remembering. It was a part of their way of life. We read in Joshua of how Joshua got 12 elders, and those 12 elders each got a large stone or a rock each. And they placed them in the middle of the river Jordan, and they were stones of remembrance. And they were there so that when anybody walked past, they could remember. In other words, they could reconnect themselves to what God had done. And there's something about this communion service which is an act of remembering, reconnecting ourselves with the covenants of God. Covenants is really the way that God works. He is a covenant-keeping God. He's made covenants with man, and he's asked us, of course, and invited us to make the great covenant with him through his son, Jesus Christ. And so remembering is a vital part of the communion service. And that's really what I want us to do in this session. As I've said, you're very welcome on each of these sessions just to use it as a simple devotional for taking communion. And maybe today or with this session, you might take the cup and remember, reconnect yourself to something that God has done. When I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, my wife and I used to go for walks in the trail just by our house in Redding, California. And one of the things we did was we remembered. And we would walk together and remind ourselves of what God had done. We would say he's never let us down before, and we don't believe that he's going to let us down now. And we reminded each other of testimonies of the things that God had done, how God had healed Sue of infertility and had given us our second son. We remembered, we reconnected ourselves. And that's what Jesus is saying. And actually, I think it's very, very significant that it is the Passover. He, of course, was, he was a Jew and he was keeping the Passover, and he wanted to keep it with this close group of people. And I think what he was actually doing was creating this seamless line right the way through from the people of Israel in bondage under the Egyptians and of course the great Passover celebration, because he knows that he's the Passover lamb. So he's creating this seamless line, and we see him at the table saying to his disciples, "Remember me." In a very real sense, every time we take this cup and we lift it up, we're doing this and we are reconnecting ourselves to the covenant, this great covenant. Jesus said, "This cup is the new covenant. The whole covenant that I have made with the people of Israel and I now make with the whole earth, all of this is in here. And so I just want to encourage you in this session to take a moment and remember. We don't build the piles of stones to remember things in our lives, although Sue and I did do that in our season of living in America. As we had each breakthrough, miraculous breakthroughs with visas and green cards and all of the wonderful things God did, we actually did buy stones of remembrance. And Sue has just an emerald ring, just as a reminder of the day that we got our green card. It was a stone of remembrance. I want you to just take a moment with the cup in your hand and do this. Remember him. Remember what he said. We are to remember, to reconnect ourselves, to reattach ourselves to the covenant, to the promises of God, to what he's done in the past. And it's one of the most wonderful things that we can do at the communion is to remember what God has done before. And that's really what Jesus was doing, I think. He's celebrating the Passover with his disciples, and he is making sure that they are all connected to the great Passover, that great Exodus, that stunning night. And we'll look a little bit more at that in the next session. But he's connecting them to that because Jesus himself is the Passover lamb, the one without spot or blemish, who will lead all of mankind from bondage to freedom. So let's just take a moment and remember, reconnect ourselves to what God has done in our lives.